Now that we've talked about the different trunking modes, let's see how to configure a trunk between SW1 and SW2 that we saw in the prior diagram. Before we do any configuration though, let's check our current state. If we want to see how a specific interface is configured for trunking at the moment, we can give this command. We can say show interface followed by the interface identifier. We're using Fast Ethernet 1/0/2 and we give the keyword of switch port. And this tells us our current state. It says currently we're operating as an access port. Our trunking mode is set to dynamic auto. Remember, dynamic auto is willing to form a trunk, but it's not going to initiate that conversation. And the other end of this connection, the other switch, SW2, it's also configured for dynamic auto. Its port is configured for dynamic auto. And as a result, even though both ports are willing to become trunk ports, nobody is initiating that conversation. Nobody is sending a DTP frame. We're going to change that in just a moment. Something else we need to be aware of is the encapsulation type. If we do form a trunk, what encapsulation type are we going to use? Are we going to use IEEE 802.1q, which is probably what we want to be using in today's switches, or do we want to use ISL? Cisco had a proprietary trunking protocol called ISL Interswitch Link many years ago, and for a time Cisco preferred that we use ISL, but now Cisco is largely moving away from ISL and towards the industry standard of 802.1q. In fact, some of Cisco's newer switches don't even support ISL. We probably want to use .1q. And right now it's being negotiated, so that's something we would want to statically configure to say, if we form a trunk, let's form a .1q trunk. And if we form a trunk, we see that our native VLAN is going to be VLAN 1. We can also see if there are any trunks configured right now on the switch. Do we have any active trunks? To see that, we can very simply do a show interface trunk. And there's no output. We have no trunk currently. Let's change that. Let's go into global configuration mode and then into interface configuration mode for the interface that we want to be a trunk port. And before I change the trunking mode, I want to force the encapsulation to .1q. I don't want that to be negotiated because I don't want it to be ISL. Let's say switch port, trunk, encapsulation. We're set to negotiate currently, and we might negotiate ISL, and I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to hard code this to .1q. .1q. Now let's change our trunking mode from dynamic auto to dynamic desirable. We'll say switch port, mode. Here are our different options. We're going to say dynamic, and I'm going to say desirable. When we do that, we should see some console messages start to pop up indicating that this interface has gone down and then come back up. And we see that on screen right now. Let's see if we have a trunk. Let's once again do a show interface Fast Ethernet 1/0/2 with the keyword of switch port, and now we are operating as a trunk. We were accessed just a moment ago, now we're trunk. We were dynamic auto a few moments ago. We changed that to dynamic desirable, causing the trunk to be formed. We also said we don't want to negotiate our encapsulation type. Let's hard code it to .1q. We see that our native VLAN is VLAN 1, and we can go over to switch SW2 and confirm that it is also seeing the trunk. Let's do a show interface gigabit 0/10 with the keyword of switch port. We're set to dynamic auto on this side, but that's okay. The other side, SW1, initiated those DTP frames, so we agreed to become a trunk. We negotiated, based on what the other side told us, we negotiated our encapsulation type, and we negotiated .1q. Our native VLAN is 1. We could also give the command show interface trunk to see the trunks or trunk configured on this switch. This was negotiated. That's what the N means. We negotiated .1q. We're trunking. Our native VLAN is 1. Let's take a look at SW1. Let's give that same command. Let's do a show interface trunk. Almost the same thing here. Instead of negotiating .1q, we had hard-coded that on this switch. The mode is desirable instead of auto. That's what we had on SW2. We're trunking, and the native VLAN is 1. We also see what VLANs are active and are in the forwarding state for this trunk. All three of our VLANs, VLAN 1, that was created for us by default. We earlier created VLANs 100 and 200, and all three of those are permitted to go across the trunk.